author of these books, among others? Dividing Hand, yes. Thank you for helping me. The latest one is the story of Gaston Naessan, and if I pronounced that wrong, he can correct me, who has done yeoman work and in the field of healthcare in Canada. For those of you who were here last year, listen real closely, because as I read the book, I felt that his methods, some of them, and his substance that he uses could be somewhat similar to the same substance that Ed Sobchak uses in the field of cancer remission control, I guess is what you could say. But the book will be available here, or is and has been available, and will give you the story. But Chris Bird himself is here to give you the inside story of what is going on with this particular area in the story of the Galileo, the microscope, Gaston Naessan. So welcome Chris Bird. He's here for the first time to our group.
Good evening. How is this microphone working? Is it working all right? Can you hear? No. If you can't hear, there's no use going on.
Well, can you hold this one? This one's the most powerful one.
Sure. How about this one? Is that better? First of all, I'd like to begin by offering to Dean Stonia that he can never make a mistake. And this is the first time in, I guess, the 8 times that he and his wife have single-handedly organized this fascinating conference that I have been here. And I want to thank Dean and Mrs. Stonier for inviting me and everybody else here. So let's give them a hand. As I've been listening here for the last 3-4 days, some very impassioned speeches and philosophies, it came to mind in the room while I was upstairs thinking about what I was going to say to you, that wouldn't it be great if we could begin to teach not ourselves, but our children. And as I look round at myself and others, our grandchildren, some of the truths that are being spoke from this podium. Because I believe that unless these truths are told to the young, unless we go on talking about mythology, the Statue of Liberty, and the rest, unless the very young can impart some of the stuff that we frustrate ourselves with, well, there's no use talking to each other in this room. I don't know how that can be done, but it's got to start. I also want to make a comment, because it sits very deep and hard in my heart, that at a group like this, I feel great fright, as all the rest of you do. We feel fright together at the lies, L-I-E-S, the untruths that are told in our society. But how can we mobilize that fright into action? If we took everybody in this room, how could we get together and march forward? Give us 10 men, and I'll give you 10,000 more. That is what I don't see to my and to your rule. I started back in 1969 after I got back from Yugoslavia, where I was a foreign correspondent, to go into what I call, and maybe you call, the weird world. And we cut our teeth because we was going to do a book on the late psychiatrist turned biophysicist Wilhelm Reich. And I read everything the guy ever wrote because I was assigned that deal, and that got me in to a world that at that time, going on 21 years ago, I never knew anything about. But we got sidetracked because we were hoping that Eva Reich, MD, the daughter of Wilhelm, would finally fight through and release from 50 years of sequestration her father's personal archives. That meant going to court. It didn't happen, so we dropped the project. When Reich died, there was a trust that was set up and said that his really interesting stuff couldn't be opened for 50 years. If you get the will, by the way, a will is the only public document, or one of the very few, that's available to anybody, and read it, you could interpret his desires in various ways, but not that. Anyway, we moved in the early 70s to do The Secret Life of Plants. Some of you have read that book. And last year, after 17 years, we done one on Secrets of the Soil, which is back there if you need to get it. And after that was done, that carried me over the world, from Australia to Russia, many European countries, and quite a few states of our union. So I got a little bit tired out, and I went to California in the early months of 1989 to work with Arthur Middleton Young, one of the true geniuses that I've ever met, inventor of the Bell helicopter. The Bell 47, first commercially licensed helicopter in the world, which rose from the pad in Buffalo, New York in 1947. And Arthur, having finished that job, it's not known anymore, he developed and organized the first institute in the United States post-war for the study of consciousness, which has been on the lips of all of us for many years, but that was 1951 when it was on the lips of nobody. And the institute still exists in Berkeley, California. So it was Arthur who introduced me to many, many things that are talked about currently now among the old and young that he started 40 years ago. He personally knew Royal Raymond Rife. How many heard of Royal Raymond Rife and his microscope? Well, quite a few. Arthur knew him personally. He personally knew Ruth Drown, pioneer in radionics. How many of us know her? There's a few. So I went out to California, and I was going to do something for Arthur, do an essay or maybe a short book on a man who was an incredible inventor and then went on to pioneer the worlds above. But on the 31st of May, 1989, I got a telephone call. I'd hardly moved to California, to say that my friend Gaston Naessan, and you pronounced it perfectly, Naessens. We just done a whole purple covered book on him. It's back there if you need to get it. Had been put in jail for 40 years of courageous research, investigation, and discovery. So I flew up to Canada the next day, the 1st of June, and till just now that I came down here, I wear this badge that says Canada. I don't really live anywhere, but I wear it with pride because I've been there for 15 months. So why was this guy put in jail? I got a flashback, like we say in the movie business. In 1978, I was driving with my late wife down from Nova Scotia to Washington, D.C., where we lived. And when we got by in Maine, the little village of Hancock, I said to her, I got Eva Reich is over there. She's got a summer house. Let's go see if she's there. So we went. And Eva knew that I had spent a lot of time, about 2 years, maybe more, researching her father's life, and especially the incredible microscopic work that he did in the final phases of it, where he discovered microorganisms in the blood having to do with healthy and unhealthy states. And she also knew that I had written an article for the New Age Journal in '76 called What Has Become of the Rife Microscope, the scope that was invented in the 20s and 30s and used by Royal Raymond Rife, a self-taught genius. So Eva said, based on those two things, Chris Bird, she said, there's a guy up in a little outback in Quebec, not too far north from the Vermont border, in a little town called Rock Forest, and I heard him give a lecture in Toronto, and she said, you got another Royal Raymond Rife to investigate. That was 1978. So we drove up there the following fall, and out of that developed a 10-year, a little bit more, series of investigations into truly one of the great investigative, medical, scientific geniuses that I have met in my life, and I've only met 3 or 4. Gaston Naessan was born in 1924 in France. By the time he was 21, years old. He developed single-handedly by consulting with the great microscopic company in Germany, Lights, a microscope which from then till now is second to none. What do I mean by that? Microscopes are rated on two levels. One of the reasons for a microscope is to magnify something. Like there's a guy back there in the back of the room, I can't tell whether he has eyebrows or not. But if I had a microscope, I could tell you if they was black or red, because we could blow them up and make them large. But there's another thing about microscopes that put the kibosh on that, and that's what we call resolution. If we take two lines, you can all clearly see that they're separated. That is, you can resolve them. But if you were seated further back in the room, way, way back, you might not be able to resolve them because they'd look like that. And if you were seated even further back, they might just blur together and you'd see nothing but one line. So the resolving power, the resolution of the microscope is as important as magnification. Because if you could take these two lines and let's say they look as large as that, but they all fuse together into one block, you wouldn't see any more division. So when you invent a microscope, it's as important to have resolution as it does increase the size. It just turns out that there's a lot of research into microscopes these days. There's going to be a meeting in Los Angeles around the 1st of October, run by Steve and Laverne Ross. I forgot the name of their outfit, but could easily get it for you. And there's a guy that's coming from Germany that says he has an interesting microscope. His name is Bernhard Muschlin. But he doesn't have the resolution that Naessan has, even though he visited Naessan in Canada 15 years ago. That's just an aside. Here's a guy with 21, 22 years old, invented a microscope that because physicists and optical specialists have, quote, not been able to figure out the mathematical constants of the technology, has thus far been unpatentable. So what did he do with it? Now at this point, I want everybody to pass out these sheets. If you take half of them down there, one row, then you'll have a little key sign as to what we're talking about. At any rate, some of it's up here. If I can hold your attention, let me say that for 50 years there have been many, many researchers in many, many countries who have found that in the blood of you, me, and every man, woman, and child, there have been certain microbial forms visible in that blood. The ones that they were able to see, we have a cycle here that begins with 1 and goes right round to 16. But the ones that they were able to see since about 1920 began with certain bacterial forms that mutated or changed as they were watched. That's not supposed to happen in bacteriology. And it's still minority knowledge. But in the 30s, people were looking at various bacterial forms, which you'll see on these sheets that's being passed out. Now, what was really amazing was that suddenly, after this line, these bacteria burst and they went on to form entities not in the so-called animal world of bacteria, but in a totally different domain, kingdom, the vegetal world of fungoid forms. What Mr. Naessan found out after long years of research was what none of these people knew who could see these forms. They thought, therefore, that these bacterial forms invaded the body from without, came in exogenously from the exterior. But with his microscope, Naessan was able to track back these forms to their origin, and he found out that they start with stage 1. Tiny, ultramicroscopic, subcellular forms existing in all of us in a healthy state, called by him somatides. It simply means tiny bodies. And gentlemen and ladies, I'll tell you now that I think this discovery is probably one of the 2 or 3 greatest of our century. It's a unique discovery. It gets to the origin of life. Now, in a healthy body, observed and taken at the microscope and film, and there is a film taken at the microscope, it's on cassette, lasts 38 minutes, in which this whole cycle is shown in living movement. In a healthy body, these little tiny forms go to stage 2, kind of little spores, and then the double spores. And then if we was to do it right, which we didn't, they return. That's health. That's the 3-stage cycle. It's just 40 years of research. But when, for one reason or another, exposure to radiation, psychological depression, bad diet, maybe a dozen other reasons, the immune system of the body gets upset. Suddenly, this stage 3 moves on around to 13 more stages to complete a pathological cycle. And that's the discovery that Mr. Naessan made at the microscope. From there, he went on to develop a whole therapy based on this knowledge, because he found that when this extra 13-stage cycle gets going, it is allied not only with cancer, but with many other degenerative diseases, including multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and several others, thereby making a common functional principle that these diseases are not, as they're claimed to be in the medical groups, separate compartments. And each one of you gets a letter every year to subscribe to money for the one or the other. In other words, they're all allied. From there, Naessan went on, you'll read about it in the book, to develop a therapy based on the immunological defense system. And he found that all of these diseases we've talked about were based on a weakening of that defense system. And there's been lots of talk about that. And we could go on and tell you how he developed a natural product injected not intramuscularly, not intravenously, but into the lymph system, which is the body's sewer pipe. The product was based on camphor, a natural product from an East Asian tree of the same name, camphor. And it had remarkable properties because it could clean up the lymph system, and for a variety of reasons that are technical, in which we won't go into, could restore the balance of the immune system, which then itself could clear the body of disease. But what I want to do in the short time remaining, because I see the clock is already 5 to the hour, is to tell you, excuse me? Okay. She says I got 20 minutes. Is to tell you what I think is one of the greatest discoveries of our century that has nothing to do with the application of this knowledge to succoring the ill. When we start with this little form up here, the somatite, it was found over years of research that this form could be taken from the blood and even from the sap of plants, of all animals, including humans. That when taken from the blood, it could be cultured and grown in vitro. That means in the laboratory in a glass dish. Cultured and grown and reproduced. It was also found, incredibly enough, that this entity is indestructible. What does that mean? It means that it could not be destroyed by any acid, however strong. It means that it cannot be destroyed by temperatures, carbonization temperatures, enough to reduce anything to ash over 200 degrees Fahrenheit. This cannot be destroyed. It means that it could not be destroyed when put at the center of the heart of an atomic reactor and exposed to 50,000 rems of radioactivity, or enough to kill any living thing. What are we talking about then? What is the somatite that swims in your blood, every one of you? How does it relate to the problems of the origin of life? Is the discovery of the century. It has electrical properties. If you prick your finger and take the blood drop and put it on a slide and immediately transfer it under Naessan's microscope, you can see these somatides in a healthy state, sparkling like snow on television. And if you're not in such a healthy state, you can see these other forms beginning to form in your blood, and you can pre-diagnose by 2 years an unhealthy state in your blood, which will appear clinically only after that time has elapsed. Now, what else is remarkable about the somatite? Despite the fact that it's indestructible. And by the way, it survives bodily death. When we all go into the ground, the somatides live on. Thousands, millions, perhaps billions of years. We're getting into an interface between the known and the esoteric. We're getting into an interface between Western medicine and Eastern medicine. we're getting into all these interfaces. I'm just reporting to you what this guy has discovered. Let's go a step further. These facts, these are not speculations. This is not theory. If you take a cube of meat, no different than the one you impale on a shish kebab skewer, and you inject that cube with somatides, the meat does not degenerate or rot, but begins to grow in size over the weeks and months and years. Why? This must be found out. Then there's another mystery. It seems as if this somatide is a precursor to that marvelous molecule discovered in the 50s called DNA, about which a lot has been written. And why is that? Because through experimentation, many times over, it has been found by the Naessans that if you take the somatides out of the blood, say, of a white-furred rabbit, and transfer them into the bloodstream of a black-furred rabbit, lo and behold, the black rabbit begins to turn white. In that somatide, there's something that's pre-DNA that works at the hereditary level. This is an astonishing finding that may revolutionize what we know about biology. But not alone that. If you take and cut a square inch of fur and skin out of the one rabbit, and an identical sized portion of fur and skin out of the other rabbit, you will find that you can graft the skin taken from the first rabbit to the second, who has received a dose of somatides from the first, and there will be no rejection effect. And what does that say about all the heart-rending experiences of organ transplants, which have most of all failed miserably, says my helper, because of the rejection effect? So with this discovery, we're right up against the very future of what we know. Now in the book, I could go on and say many other things, but time's a wasted. And it's all in here anyways. The book's back there. But the local medical authorities in Quebec were bound and determined to get rid of this guy. It could have been elsewhere. Could have been Colorado, or Idaho, but it was Quebec. And it was the more vicious Because of all the places in North America, Quebec is the only islet where they talk a foreign language, French. And everything is in French up there, from the newspapers to the advertisements to the street signs and to what's said in court. And it was lucky that back somewhere in my life that I was able to master the French language, to be able to sit through an historic trial, which, had it gone wrong, would have put a genius in jail for life. It lasted 22 days, and I took, don't worry, we're going to give him 10 minutes for questions. We got 10 minutes more, as just warned. I sat there in the courtroom, and we put this historic trial into this book, and I just received a letter from a senior lawyer in the Quebec court saying that this trial will go down in recent Canadian history as a benchmark in all questions concerning our fight, your fight and mine, for freedom of choice against the dictators who would tell us about our health. So I could go on and tell you lots more about what we put down in this book, but it's all there. I'd like to, in the last 8 minutes that's left to me, turn it over to you so that you could ask me a couple of questions about some aspects of the subject that I forgot to talk to you about tonight. But I want to leave it with you before we begin that I believe that the discovery of the somatide is one of the biggies of this century. By the way, it seems to be an entity which somehow is on the border or falls between what we call, and you're familiar with that, the ancient Vedic divide, Vedic Indian divide, between the physical body and what we call the etheric body, which could be termed the electrical body. Why is that? Because it turns out that these somatides, when you see them on a slide, they have electrical properties. As how determined? It's very obvious when you see them that they repulse one another. They never come into contact. It's as if billiard balls on a green baize table were electrically charged and never could hit one another, so there couldn't be a billiards game. Furthermore, if you put them on this slide and you take a magnet, let's say they're on a slide, and you take a magnet and approach it, say a bar magnet, north-south, they start moving over, proving their electromagnetic properties. Now, there's been a lot of literature around, very exciting stuff in the last 30 years, starting with Albert St. George, the great Hungarian who won the Nobel Prize for the discovery of vitamin C, ascorbic acid. who looked into life and its problems. And the time his life was over, he said, it ain't at the molecular level and it ain't at the atomic level. Life is electricity, and of course that is also what's been opened up by Dr. R.O. Becker. The body electric. A lot of you have read his book, and the next one is up for sale back there. But here comes the discovery of somatite, which has got electrical properties. I think it's a kind of fascinating and exciting thing. I welcome that you've allowed me to tell you all these things, and I await your questions. Thank you.
Could you tell us what kind of research is going on this project now? Is our medical society involved in it in this country?
No, what I can tell you about this country is that since we put this book out in Canada, number one, we're extending it for publication in the States. It should be out about January. But we've got, out of our own personal efforts, this book around the medical world, and there's various enlightened doctors that have taken active interest in this, and some of them have already come up to Naessan's lab in Canada to see what's going on and take the knowledge back to the U.S. and get going with it, which, by the way, I will say is not happening in his home province in Quebec, where everything is locked up tight. Next question. Yes, sir.
You mentioned Reich before. You mentioned Wilhelm Reich before. Now, Reich used to heat sand, and he would observe bions, which he considered the beginning of life. Is that basically the same?
Well, no. There's a man that's a man of knowledge, see? And all men of knowledge ask you impossible questions. And I wish I knew. Your name is Dr. Lutke, and I listened to your speech. Now, the only guy that we should bug on a question as to where the somatides fit with Reich's bions is Dr. Bernard Grad in Montreal. Do you know him? Well, Bernie Grad was one of the apprentices that years back, I guess it goes 35 or 40 years back, worked with Dr. Wilhelm Reich in Organon in Maine. And Grad has a file this high on the bions, and he's been out to see in Naessan's microscope the somatides, but so far, Dr. Lutke and everybody else, I have not been able to get from Dr. Bernard Grad an explanation of how the somatides might fit with the bions. So we got a few mysteries up there that we got to confront.
Back here, Chris. Chris, could you share with the audience the court decision in this particular situation?
I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, and this is most important for all of us. There were 5 counts against this brave investigator. The most serious would have put him in jail for life. They were brought by the Quebec Medical Corporation in Quebec. That's the American Medical Association. I think it's a triumph that a jury made up of 5 men and 6 women, none of whom had any what could be called higher education. I think it's a triumph that they saw through the claims, on the one hand, of the prosecution, very narrow. This guy was a murderer. And the arguments of the defense, on the other, a very broad spectrum. 40 years of work and labor. It was a beautiful confrontation. Like the prosecution was trying to thrust one time with a sword and kill. And the defense was fighting in a huge arena. Like one valiant man with a mace against veteran soldiers. And these 11 jury people, no different than you or I, returned a verdict, acquitted on all counts. Please.
What was he charged with?
The most serious charge, what was he charged with? The most serious charge was contributing to the death of a patient. There were other additional ones, but had he been put away for that, that would have been life imprisonment. Anybody else?
Well, okay, that's, the clock on the wall says it's time to go, Chris, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Dean.
Go on and on, but the great work that's been done up there needs to be known.
Okay.
He'll be around for a while.